Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity.
First things first, let me apologize for the sound of my voice. I am still recovering from being a bit sick, so it might not be as soothing as usual, but it is still me. I'm still John. I will try to keep the nasaliness to a minimum. Let's get into today's topic. One of the most difficult challenges in critiquing Christianity in the United States is that religion is so intertwined with mythologies about this country's origin. The myth that many of us were told in formal education went something like there were these Christians in England who weren't allowed to worship the way they thought was biblical, so they decided to sail away to this legend of land that they had heard about from Columbus and others. And then a Plymouth Rock and Revolutionary War later, our founding fathers wrote a constitution with their first priority being allow people to worship however they want without fear of government getting involved or dishing out punishments. Thus, we owe so much of the United States' prosperity, liberty, and principles to those Christians who were bold enough to serve their God more than their government. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when one grows up and realizes that this narrative is not only incomplete, but likely deliberately misleading, one starts to wonder what else has been a lie. In that narrative, there is no mention of the genocide of Native Americans. There is no mention of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and the slavery required to jumpstart it. There is no mention of the clear beliefs most Europeans had that the white race was superior. There is no mention of the Salem witch trials. There is no mention of how half the Constitution's writers owned slaves. And one cannot help but wonder whether freedom was for all or for some. In my last episode, I mentioned the Westminster Confession of Faith, which on a fundamentally philosophical level believed that freedom could only be found in believing in God, and even then, their views of freedom were almost contrary to the definition. Apart from God, our freedom is limited to the scope of doing evil. With God, we most often do evil, but sometimes God does good through us. And when we die and are glorified, our freedom is still limited to the scope of only doing good. In none of these phases does humanity seem autonomous. Perhaps this Puritan Protestant ideology is why the Founding Fathers' view of freedom was already so skewed. Freedom should be understood as the power to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Yet the early founding of this country clearly had restraints in place for certain kinds of people. We'll revisit this history more later. I hope it will be helpful to explore what religious freedom could mean and what it most often does mean. Religious liberty could mean freedom of an individual or community in public or private to manifest a belief in any teachings or practices or worshiping or observances without fear of discrimination. Before we even get into how this practically works out, it's worth asking a fundamental question. Is this a good idea? I mean, initially, especially with American conditioning, I and others likely want to affirm that this is a basic human right. But is it? Should an individual or community privately or publicly be allowed to practice any religion without discrimination? The main potential problems with this idea of religious liberty is one, what if one's religion permits or commands harm to oneself or society? Two, is someone permitted to change their religious beliefs anytime they wish? Firstly, most would assume that religious freedom is only protected if it stays within the bounds of the law of the land. Philosophically, that simply cannot be true. because one's mind goes to the First Amendment, where freedom of religion is equivocated to freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the freedom to peaceably assemble. Surely we still can understand that freedom of speech does not grant permission to make threats, freedom of the press does not give the right to trespass, and freedom to peaceably assemble essentially means nothing, because assembling in a group can be perceived as disturbing the peace by the powerful. But this is a legal understanding. Philosophically, freedom of religion means that one can believe anything at any time. Modern day, this seems like a no-brainer, but for arguably most of history, this has not been common. State religion, compelled religion, and coerced and forced religion have been what is prevalent. Instead of thinking of this theory as a freedom from discrimination, it is more helpful to think of it as a freedom from oppression. Atheism is not illegal. That has not always been true in all contexts. Religious freedom is in the truest sense protects theistic, agnostic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs, as well as the freedom to abstain from any religious beliefs or any practices. In fact, the more diversity in religious beliefs, the more likely a tolerant society could be built. Therefore, religious freedom is good, not for the purpose of protecting any specific religion, but rather to protect all people from religious tyranny. But is that what religious freedom most often means? Remember, religious freedom could mean the protection of the freedom to choose your own religion. Most often, it seems to protect established religions or exempt individuals or communities from laws that they don't want to obey. Now, before you think I'm getting on my anti-religious armchair ranting with a grumpy cigar as I sit by a bonfire fueled by the pages of religious books, I am not immediately dismissing the need to protect religious beliefs. Don't worry, I'll be yelling "get off my lawn" to the Christians soon enough. But first, let's explore the idea of religious discrimination. Religious discrimination is treating a person or group differently because of the beliefs which they hold. Instances when adherents of different religions, denominations, or non-religions are treated unequally can be quite problematic, especially as it relates to employment, housing, or other essentials. Again, treating someone different because they have no religion is no better or worse than treating someone different because of their religion. This is an essential truth if religious liberty is going to be discussed. Religious discrimination is a much tamer version of religious persecution, wherein religious or irreligious folks are banished, tortured, or killed for their beliefs. Discrimination might not be as violent as that, but it is as hostile. One of the earliest instances of such hostility was a forceful Hellenization of Jews. Practices such as Holy Shabbat, public readings of the Torah, and infant circumcision were banned, while certain kinds of pagan worship was mandated and enforced. In fact, I would argue that starting in ancient Rome up until and maybe even including modern day, no religious group has been discriminated against more than Jews. Although post 9/11, Islamophobia has been on a rapid incline in Western countries, and tension in the Middle East among different sects has only escalated. Catholics and Protestants have taken turns being bigoted against each other during different eras after the Reformation. Even in the U.S., Catholics had to find a way to engage with communal worship with Protestants and assimilated with no priests or typical hierarchies until this tension subsided significantly later. In general, the West seems to be more tolerant of diversity of religion than any other era or region. Even so, the options are limited if you want true freedom to practice your religion. Herein lies the fundamental flaw of practically understanding religious liberty. If most countries have now agreed that religious freedom is a basic human right, why is religious discrimination not only common, but blatantly inconsistent? whether it be controversies about whether a mosque or synagogue can be built versus the compulsion of some kids to say a socialist minister's poem, bastardized 50 years later with theistic dogma with the addition of under God, sometimes daily in school. There are a lot of social factors that go beyond religion and have much more to do with the sociology of American people, politics, and propaganda. Before getting into the founding of the U.S., it is worth pointing out that the father of modern Western philosophy was murdered for his divergence from his city's religious practices. Socrates was a polarizing figure in Athens, and in 399 BCE, he was accused of corrupting the youth and failed to acknowledge the city's official gods. After a trial that lasted only one day, he was sentenced to death and killed. Even more notable, Jesus was crucified in part because of religious discrimination. The only religion we know that Jesus ever practiced was Judaism. However, it is quite apparent that his Judaism was incongruent with the religious leaders of his day. While there are questions to be asked about how persecuted early Christians were, there was certainly some oppression, at least prior to Constantine. Even though Constantine did a lot in the name of religious tolerance, quite quickly Christianity became a state religion and rather intolerant. As Christianity evolved, it did not get more accepting and peaceful, but rather branched out over thousands of years to the point of being such a large umbrella term that many different kinds of beliefs fit under it. The diversity was not a happy family. Bloodshed, violence, and institutional systematic bigotry was instilled Christian to Christian. When the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, they were far from the first settlers. Others had made the journey in the name of seeking religious freedom, including some Spanish Catholics and French Protestants. Not to mention the native people had various spiritual beliefs and practices territory to territory. A phrase commonly used by our alleged heroic pilgrims was to build their city upon a hill. In all honesty, they were seeking to build a theocracy fortified against any dissent or rebellion. This was not theoretical. Dissenters within the Puritan community were banished if they challenged establishment theology and politics. Catholics, at the time called the derogatory term papist, were declared anathema and heretics and banned from the colonies. Quakers were hung in Boston between 1659 and 1661 for persistently returning to the city to stand up for their beliefs. George Washington, our first president, dispatched Benedict Arnold on a mission to court French-Canadian support for the American Revolution and cautioned Arnold not to let their religion get in the way. Quote, "Prudence, policy, and a true Christian spirit will lead us to look with compassion upon their errors without insulting them." After Benedict was famously caught being a traitor, he justified his actions in part because he was against those in the U.S. who were tolerant of Catholics. In the early days of the independence of the U.S., in many states only Christians were allowed to hold public office, and Catholics were allowed to do so only after renouncing papal authority. In Maryland, Catholics had full civil rights, but Jews did not. Delaware required an oath affirming belief in the Trinity. Several states, including Massachusetts and South Carolina, had official state-supported churches. Once one verifies this information for themselves, it is hard to look at U.S. history in the same light. The story seems to be a lot less about religious freedom and more about freedom to establish a different religious state. To be fair, I think this was in some ways out of ignorance alone. I think the early U.S. leaders believed their religion to be more tolerant of general humanity than the religions they were rebelling against. The problem was they did not even recognize the humanity of people who looked different from them. Even so, there were many deist, secularist, and tolerant men who influenced the culture and ended up contributing greatly to both the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Themes of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were declared God-given rights, regardless of whether or not those who had those rights believed in the same God or not. What I find important to note about this founding of a country is that those who wanted to protect the country from state-sanctioned religion were not chiefly reacting to what happened in England hundreds of years prior. They were reacting to the religious strife that was already present within the colonies. States were sanctioning religious beliefs and practices. Establishment of religious freedom was not done by Christians primarily. It was done by men who recognized the harm being done by Christians. The reason this is important to recognize is that American culture had to adjust to these laws. The laws were not produced holistically or organically from a monolithic society. The powerful white men of society were seeing white men harm other white men. The religious tolerance mandated by the Constitution was to protect white men from harming white men. It says as much. This isn't said as some sort of invalidation of the principle of religious tolerance. It is just important to consider people's sociology when determining their philosophies. Anti-Catholic sentiment was still robust, primarily out of fear that tolerating Catholicism would lend itself to papal control. This fear was based in some accurate understandings of how much power the Pope held, but it was reductive in that it viewed the entire scope of Catholic people as beholden to papal loyalty. Not all Catholics were loyal to the Pope, especially not over the country. In the U.S., many Catholics had the same issues with the Pope's absolute authority that Protestants did, but Catholics assimilated best they could. But they still suffered violent persecution and still do suffer hostile discrimination from certain kinds of Protestants. Centuries after the Constitution acknowledged religious freedom. Even as late as 1960, Catholic presidential candidate John F. Kennedy declared that his loyalty was to America, not the Pope. He felt compelled to tell the country this. And even as the U.S. has grown, evolved, and become a melting pot for better or worse, I find one specific movement to be a solidifier of American hypocrisy on the topic of religious liberty. The rhetoric in the 1950s that identified the threat of communism as godless established the country's fear of atheism as institutional. Ironically, this fear of communism is one of the things that likely began to unite fundamental Calvinist Protestants and papal Catholics. Once these were united, Christianity became the most fortified political power in the United States. But why were these ideologies so concerned that communism was atheistic? This is a nuanced and complicated historical occurrence, but I will do my best to summarize it. Prior to 1917, the Russian Orthodox Church was deeply integrated into the autocratic state. The Soviet Union, formed by a faction of Marxist ideologues, had seen all the harm that theocracy had caused, so they decreed the Soviet Union as atheist. More than that, there was a government-sponsored program of conversion to atheism, that's a direct quote, conducted by communists. Pretty clear that this is not religious freedom if the state is sanctioning atheism with the goal of eliminating existing religions. It is important to note that most organized religions were never technically outlawed, but religious property was confiscated, believers were harassed, and religion was ridiculed. The main impact the communists were trying to have is to remove religion from public spaces. There was no discouragement of private practices of religion. The issue was with governing officials having religious priorities or media participating in religious propaganda. I will condemn this group of radical communists in a minute, but I find it profitable to forego American indoctrination and empathize with them for a moment. Karl Marx, famously said, "Religion is the opium of the people, it is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions." Many have interpreted this quote differently, but I tend to read it not as a condemnation of the religious, but rather a condemnation of society. Marx seems to observe the accurate nature of religious institutions protecting the bourgeoisie and classes above. in a sense, places that talk about helping the poor without tangibly helping the poor provides more destruction and not harm reduction. Religion can be violent by its very nature, and its pain relief can be as deceptive as an opioid. Now, I would argue this was not a statement that asked for the eradication of religion, but rather assumed that there would be no religion in a just society. There would be no need. Clearly, this was not how all communists viewed this idea. Radical Marxist atheism consistently advocated the control, suppression, and elimination of religion. Within about a year of the Soviet Union's revolution, the state obtained all church property, including the churches themselves, and in the period from 1922 to 1926, 28 Russian Orthodox bishops and more than 1,200 priests were killed. Many more were removed, forcibly converted, or fled. Given this context, it makes sense that Americanism was opposed to the Soviet Union in no uncertain terms. One can understand how a prolific minister perceived as peaceful, such as Billy Graham, could be quoted as saying communism is demon-possessed. For every action, there is an equal or opposite reaction, and in my opinion, sociology has shown that there is an equal or greater opposite reaction when it comes to large movements. Undoubtedly, the Soviet Union was unfair and destructive. The problem is that Christians seemed less concerned with the USSR and more about the ideologies of atheism and communism. Before I critique this approach, I will acknowledge that I often am concerned with ideological factors that play into bad behaviors, both in individuals and communities. I engage in this criticism a lot on this podcast. I'm aware that I can be called a hypocrite if I divorce ideology from behavior too much. Even so, I must protest that Christians in the United States were wrong to identify atheism or communism as the problem. The problem with the Soviet Union and other autocratic states has indeed been a problem regarding religious freedom. In the 1950s, Christians made a strategic choice, not a moral one. As many Christian leaders throughout its history have admitted, Christianity grows more when it is perceived to be persecuted than when it is tolerated. Call it the underdog factor. Christianity has built-in martyrdom and messiah complexes. Anything that can feed these complexes is fuel that fans flames and does not damper its adherents. The Soviet Union's plan to convert masses to atheism failed greatly. If you directly tell anyone not to do something, they damn well want to do it. Likewise, if you directly tell people they are incapable of doing something no matter how hard they try, they damn well try to do it. Both facts about human psychology lend a hand to Christianity. Christianity will tell you that you can never be Christian enough, but they all try their hardest. Much more appealing psychologically than someone saying, "Don't believe in God." Communism and atheism might be in competition with Christianity, but the Soviet Union was not. The radical autocrats somewhere out there were the perfect uniting enemy and scapegoat that served the growth of both conservatism and Christianity, which was a toxic marriage ready to form at the drop of a hat. Church affiliation rose from 55% to 69% during the 1950s. To be with a church was to be against all the evil of that godless communism. This is the era in which under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Naturally, conservative factions of both Protestant and Catholic churches grew, and progress and anti-war denominations shrank. After all, this godless communism was not only a threat to religious institutions, but it was also a threat to religious freedom. In the U.S., that meant it was a threat to your freedom to believe, to speak, to investigate, and to assemble. Most importantly, communism has an ideology that combats capitalism. It attacks private property, unfair labor practices, and lies of meritocracy, 3 pillars of how the United States formed and continues to exist. Perhaps there was more than one thing going on here. Perhaps while U.S. citizens were predisposed to loathe a radical, atheist, communist state, maybe some clever religious leaders were able to leverage that disposition into commitment towards an equally sinister theocratic capitalism. One must remember, the radical atheist communists that formed the Soviet Union were reacting to a state church, one that was in deep denial about its power, that was declaring atheism to only produce sorrow and suffering. Most intellectuals were claiming a society without God would be necessarily immoral. In some sense, the overreaction of the communist revolution only fed that narrative. After the revolution, the Russian Orthodox Church found itself without official state backing for the first time in its history. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the brutal communist movement, was deeply impacted by a range of factors, but there's one important one to note. His older brother, most often called Sasha, was labeled a terrorist sympathizer because he loudly demanded change within the Russian Empire. This empire, remember, that was intertwined with the Russian Orthodox Church, enacted strict regulations on school curriculum and books with the express purpose of shielding students from ideas of socialism, liberalism, atheism, and any philosophy that would challenge the state dogma. Sasha became convinced that the only hope for a revolution was to assassinate Tsar Alexander III, the emperor. Sasha hoped that by assassinating Alexander III, a full-scale revolution would be ignited, causing the end of tyrannical monarchies. The date he and other co-conspirators chose was symbolic, March 1st, 1887, the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Alexander II. The attempt failed, and during the various interrogations, Sasha took it upon himself to take the lion's share of the blame for the conspiracy, even when he was not the main actor. During trial, there would be opportunities for Sasha to plead for a pardon, and if he had distanced himself from either atheism or communism, it would have helped his case. Others were begging for him to just lie and just say he was religious because that was the easiest way to get pardon. He refused. In his final address to the court, he stated, quote, "My purpose was to aid in the liberation of the unhappy Russian people. Under a system which permits no freedom of expression and crushes every attempt to work for their welfare and enlightenment by legal means, the only instrument that remains is terror. We cannot fight this regime in open battle because it too firmly entrenched and commands enormous powers of repression. Therefore, any individual sensitive to injustice must resort to terror. Terror is our answer to the violence of the state. It is the only way to force a despotic regime to grant political freedom to people. There is no death more honorable than death for the common good." End quote. Interesting, isn't it? What is religious freedom supposed to be about? Where is the freedom of religion in this story? And in no way am I condoning the murdering that this man's younger brother systemically committed. In fact, it seems clear that terrorism was not the answer in the face of oppression. But it does beg the question, what else could he do? It seems Americans are either unfamiliar or unempathetic as to how the communist plight parallels their mythologies of Puritans fleeing religious oppression. In fact, you could make the argument that at least Sasha and Vladimir chose to fight their battles at home rather than go commit genocide somewhere new. There are no heroes in any of these stories, at least in my opinion. Choosing an ideology to subscribe to is part of this whole problem. The desire of state-sanctioned religion, religious anarchy, the eradication of religion, and the rest all seem to be different ways of trying to attain an idea of peace. The question is, peace for whom? I've only mentioned a fraction of the bloodshed that has occurred in the name of religious liberty. And in doing so, I've already mentioned millions of murderers. So what the fuck is all the violence for? What does it prove? We can pretend this is all part of the past if we'd like to be blissfully ignorant. The fact is, most conflicts in the Middle East surround religious preferences and exceptionalism types and exceptionalist beliefs about entitlements to land. As late as 2009's Christopher Hitchens, rest in peace, reported the following in Vanity Fair, quote, "On Monday in May, I was setting off from Washington to Colorado Springs, home of the United States Air Force Academy. I had kindly been invited by the Academy's Free Thinkers Association, a loose-knit group of cadets and instructors who are without a religious affiliation. As I was making ready to depart and checking my email, I found I had been sent a near incredible video clip from Al Jazeera Network. It had been shot at Bagram Air Force Base last year, and it showed a borderline hysterical address by one Lieutenant Colonel Gary Hensley, chief of the United States military chaplains in Afghanistan. He was telling his evangelical audience, all of them wearing uniforms supplied by the taxpayer, that as followers of Jesus Christ, they had a collective responsibility, quote, to be witness for him. Heating up this theme, Lieutenant Colonel Hensley went on, the Special Forces guys, they hunt men, basically. We do the same things as Christians. We hunt people for Jesus. We do. We hunt them down. Get the hound of heaven after them so we get them in the kingdom, right? That's what we do. That's our business, end quote. Continuing with Hitchens' quote. The comparison to the Special Forces would seem to suggest that the objects of this hunting and hounding are Afghans rather than Americans. But it's difficult to be certain, and indeed I am invited to Colorado Springs partly because chaplains there have been known to employ taxpayer dollars to turn the hounds of heaven loose on their own students and fellow citizens. End of Hitchens' quote. In the news frequently are different states introducing all sorts of legislation under the guise of religious freedom, whether this be enforcing anti-abortion penalties, limited sex education in school, or giving organizations legal exemption in discriminatory practices. Shouldn't the right to think how you want be limited when it limits others to think how they want? Shouldn't the right to speak how you want be limited when it limits others to speak how they want? Shouldn't the right to behave how you want be limited when it limits how others behave? Believing something deeply doesn't make it right. The problem one might identify goes back to humanity's inability to figure out a good measure for what is harmful versus harmless. In some sense, nothing is harmless. We see all sorts of things producing harm, accidentally or intentionally, all the time. In another sense, nothing is harmful because humans have this sense of destiny and everything working out for some kind of greater good. In the middle of all that theory, it'd be nice to reduce assaults, murders, and suicides. And churches have more money than sociologists. Maybe it's just easier to believe in God than make tough assessments about how humanity functions. Maybe white men still benefit more in sacred spaces than out here in the real world. The thing that Christians must acknowledge, which will be especially tough for evangelicals in the United States, is that they do not believe in a tolerant religion. Jesus never endorsed a tolerant or kind religion, but rather an exclusive apocalyptic faith that rejected hierarchies and only focused on loving the Jewish God and other Jews. At best, Jesus endorsed apathy toward the rest. Further, the New Testament is quick to condemn larger society as enemies of God if they don't do it Jesus' way, or Paul's way more accurately. All the kindness and tolerance Christianity has ever engaged with has either been assumptions derived from the character of Jesus or for its own survival in hostile times. By its nature, Christianity does not believe in the freedom of religion. For this reason, I think evangelicals cannot articulate coherently what they mean when they claim to defend religious liberty. They are defending Christian exceptionalism. For the Christians, religious freedom is their belief that they should receive special treatment, be regarded as above or separate from the law, and that no one can impede whatever they think is God decreed. This exceptionalism passes as a protecting freedom not only in theory but in practice. Here's a summary from O'Hay, slightly edited by me, of one of the most infamous court cases that illustrates this very point. In July 2012, Charlie Craig and David Mullins went to Masterpiece Cake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado, and requested that its owner, Jack C. Phillips, design and create a cake for their wedding. Phillips declined to do so on the grounds that he does not create wedding cakes for same-sex weddings because of his religious beliefs. Phillips believes that decorating cakes is a form of art through which he can honor God, and it would displease God to create cakes for the same-sex marriages. Craig and Mullins filed charges of discrimination with the Colorado Civil Rights Division, alleging discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, often called CADA. After the division issued a notice of determination finding probable cause, Craig and Mullins filed a formal complaint with the Office of Administrative Courts, alleging that Masterpiece discriminated against them in a place of public accommodation in violation of CADA. The administrative law judge issued a written formal order finding in favor of Craig and Mullins, which was affirmed by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. And on appeal, the Colorado Court of Appeals subsequently affirmed the commission's ruling. However, this ruling was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. The court reversed in a 7-2 decision, holding that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission's conduct in evaluating a cake shop owner's reasons for declining to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple violated the Free Exercise Clause. The court explained that while gay persons and same-sex couples are afforded civil right protections under the laws and the Constitution, religious and philosophical objections to same-sex marriage are protected views and can also be protected forms of expression. The Colorado law at issue in this case, which prohibited discrimination against gay people in purchasing products and service, had to be applied in a neutral manner regarding religion. The majority acknowledged that from Phillips' perspective, creating cakes was a form of artistic expression and a component of his sincere religious beliefs. The court also explained that in 2012, the year that Phillips refused his services to Craig and Mullins, the law in Colorado and across the country regarding same-sex marriage was much more unsettled than it became after the United States versus Windsor. At the time, the state Civil Rights Division had also concluded that in at least 3 other cases, the bakers had acted lawfully in declining to make cakes that included messages they disagreed with, specifically messages demeaning gay persons. Thus, it was not unreasonable for Phillips to believe that he was acting lawfully at the time, and his claims before the commission were entitled to neutral treatment. The court stated that Phillips did not receive this neutral treatment, with members of the commission showing clear and impermissible hostility towards his religious beliefs. The court explained that commissioners' comments disparaging Phillips' beliefs and characterizing them as rhetorical were inappropriate, though these comments were not mentioned or disavowed in subsequent legal proceedings. The court concluded that these comments cast doubt on the fairness of the commissioner's consideration of Phillips' claims. The court also pointed out that the disparities between Phillips' case and those of other bakers with objections to making cakes with anti-gay messages and who were victorious before the commission further reflected hostility toward the religious basis for Phillips' position. The court concluded that the commission's actions violated the state's duty under the First Amendment not to use hostility towards religion or a religious viewpoint as a basis for laws and regulation. Under the facts of the case, the court determined that Phillips' religious justification for his refusal to serve Craig and Mullins was not afforded the neutral treatment mandated by the Free Exercise Clause. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, rest in peace, while not a perfect being, aptly pointed out one of the biggest flaws in this ruling in her dissent from the majority. She said, quote, Phillips declined to make a cake he found offensive where the offensiveness of the product was determined solely by the identity of the customer requesting it. The three other bakeries declined to make cakes where their objection to the product was due to the demeaning message the requested product would literally display, end quote. Issues of identity are of primary concern when it comes to Christians. While this can manifest as harmless or even helpful at times, there's always a darker side to Christian identity. The Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, is a Christian fraternal organization founded in the South in the post-Civil War period that perpetuated white supremacy through acts of terrorism. Consistently, as high as the Supreme Court, our country has only condemned the acts of terror itself and not the identity itself. In fact, the amendment that should protect from the perils of state-sanctioned religion has defended religious terrorists, great and small. The KKK had waves and movements and has routinely been shot down whenever white men were in power. Only when white fright has been heightened do homegrown terrorists such as the KKK rise in numbers. The 1950s and that godless communism rhetoric reignited them once more. Membership peaked in the 1960s at about 17,000 members of the KKK. Comparisons between the KKK and MAGA terrorists have been made many times. These groups both seem to be characterized by racism, violence, and calls for white supremacy. The KKK call themselves Christian, as do many MAGA cultists. No matter how badly a more level-headed Christian might want to invalidate these claims, they have no grounds. Religious freedom grants people the right to claim whatever religion they want. Legitimacy of faith cannot be tested when the faith is in something so theoretical. The question of what can be permitted under a law of religious liberty can only be answered with observations about what has been permitted under a law of religious liberty. Look at our institutions. There has never been a self-identified atheist Supreme Court justice, president, and most politicians at every level are Christian. 88% of Congress is Christian, with the majority of them being evangelical Protestants. The Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, asserts that elected officials should look to Scripture when making policy, quote, because every problem we have in America has a solution in the Bible, end quote. Senator Ted Cruz frequently talks about restoring America to what he believes is its original identity as a Christian nation. Often, Republicans and Democrats alike will allude to their faith or schmooze a mini religious liberty stump speech around campaign time. Sometimes this is dishonest pandering for a few more votes. Sometimes this is admission to a loyalty to a faith before the state, and both are problematic, but the latter scares me more. Ironic, isn't it? It seems to me the best way to produce true religious freedom would be a humanist or secular state. Not for the sake of humanism or secularism, but just to allow the fairest playing field for all religions. Instead, churches are the most powerful institutions in our country with almost zero accountability. Ministers are exempted from jury duty in some states. They are exempted by federal law from military service. Confidential communications made to ministers are generally protected against compelled disclosure in a court of law. And one of the most demonstrably damaging privileges of a minister is the exemption of pastoral counseling from laws prohibiting the unauthorized practice of psychology. The number of laws licensed therapists and counselors must follow to keep their practice is actually quite difficult, expensive, and overwhelming. Pastors can simply counsel however they want, in whatever means they want, which so easily lends to abuse and misinformation touting. Churches are famously tax exempt in the United States. The theory behind this is twofold. There's a separation of church and state, and the state assumes most of a church's income is being used for the good of society. And that latter idea is demonstrably laughable. Most states offer tax exemptions for parsonages or others' dwellings provided to clergy. In other words, they effectively subsidize pastors' houses. Several states allow religious foster care and adoption agencies that receive state funding to discriminate against potential parents, and in some states, even the vulnerable youth themselves, based on their beliefs, which primarily is applied to anyone queer. A few states allow government officials, such as county clerks and judges, to invoke their religious beliefs about marriage as a legitimate reason to opt out of providing government services to same-sex couples. During the COVID-19 pandemic, most states passed exemptions that excuse religious organizations from being required to follow public health restrictions implemented during emergencies. Lawmakers passed sweeping exemptions that shielded religious organizations from civil and criminal liability, potentially even outside the context of public health emergencies. And this is problematic because while the guise might have been the right to worship in person during a pandemic, some of these churches might now not be held criminally liable or civilly liable for the other kinds of crime, including fraud, negligence, or even abuse. I mean, believe it or not, there were active anti-blasphemy laws as late as 1950 here in the U.S. that disallowed challenging churches publicly. I don't know how to make it any clearer that the U.S., not now and not ever, has been championing religious freedom. Religious freedom that only provides freedom to one religion is not true freedom, and it's much less true religion. I find it analogous as if I were to say, I care about the freedom to listen to my podcast. However you choose, provided, you don't listen to podcasts that challenge my point of view or make me follow the rules of any podcast host or make me pay the same taxes as other podcasters. And I called it podcast freedom. In public, I'd advocate for its protection, and I'd fearmonger if it was lost. I'd align my cause with any deconstructionist, evangelical, or atheist podcast and put aside my problems with those categories. But when it comes to the freedom to reject listening to podcasts or to demand I stop hate speech on my podcast or an appeal to Spotify's rules that I violate every episode, I'd simply keep saying, what about my podcast liberty? This sounds absurd. Clearly the ones with ulterior motives are not those trying to make the rules fair. I would be the one oppressing, not being oppressed. Let's give a little more special attention to the evangelical movement. As already established many times on this show, evangelicalism took Calvinistic Protestantism and refined it into a palatable conservative political culture that was anti-communist, anti-integration, and opposed to the rights of the lower classes. The codified language used by Falwell Sr. and others used ideas of religious freedom to hide their bigotry. Religious freedom was the answer to perceived religious persecution. However, that persecution wasn't even discrimination, but anti-discrimination. Because Christians could no longer be justified politically in a way that allowed their homogeneous and bigoted views, they sought refuge in their religion. Further, religious freedom gave them more legal and cultural precedent to advance their agenda. This most infamously manifests itself in the rhetoric of anti-abortion advocation, a traditionally liberal idea, because saving babies sounded better than don't put a black kid on the same bus as my child. The convoluted messaging that evolved and was deliberated subtly took years to recognize, but now there is much literature that addresses these topics if anyone cares to look. Many evangelicals will never look, though. After all, they can barely admit that Jesus was born Jewish, that Paul heavily influenced Christianity in a Western philosophical direction, that Constantine ruled as a Christian emperor, that the Crusades were the Christians' faults, that Puritans were not pure, that Native American spirituality was criminalized by Christians, that slavery was justified by churches, or any number of sociological discoveries. Evangelicals are left clinging to simple platitudes of Jesus loves me because the Bible tells me so. And their thought doesn't go much further than that. In short, evangelicalism does what any cult must do. Remember how I said in the 1950s Christianity did not shrink but rather exploded due to Messiah complexes? One of the subtle ways that a cult leader can prey on the most vulnerable and kind among us is by tickling one's ego in a way that is so discreet it is barely recognizable. To die or fight for a cause, to believe that you are participating in spiritual warfare with the good guys, to believe that you are outnumbered but never outgunned, these are motivating factors that can allure anyone. If I tell you that you are unworthy, but then give you a worthy cause, I have given you a problem and a solution. You are controlled by that narrative without feeling like you've done anything wrong. You are simply believing the impossible for some sake of the greater good. In some sense, how admirable. But then, as part of your commitment to the cause, you contain yourself to be around the like-minded. Not necessarily as an isolationist, though we know there are versions of cults that exist in that way, but more so like-minded in principle. You are careful to look to advice from leaders of the movement. After all, they have the most experience and credibility. You are comfortable engaging with the others, but you are always looking for more recruits to join the cause. So you might seek to convert everybody aggressively, or hope they observe your passionate devotion and be convinced themselves to be with the good guys. Either way, conversion is on your mind. Even the most isolationists of cults had to convert someone at some point. In fact, at some point in all cultist ideology, every human will be converted or suffer. Some allow for conversion in an afterlife or reincarnation or after due suffering. Ultimately, the cultist assumes they've got it right. In other words, if you don't want to convert anyone, you might not be fully committed. And where does religious freedom fall into that picture? Same place as freedom of any kind exists within a cult. Nowhere.
If you wish to learn more about what's going on in my life, or wish to purchase my book, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, please continue to listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for additional content. For only $5 a month, you'll have access to 2 additional shows, Parsing Propaganda, where I review and critique Christian content, and Art, where we try some amateur religious trauma therapy. Every subscriber becomes a part of something bigger than this podcast as we endeavor to hold churches accountable, speak the truth boldly, and most importantly, love others despite our pain. Thank you for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.